Good afternoon and welcome to this AD Talk session on the geography of discontents in the Global South. My name is Uduak Amimo, and it's a pleasure to be your moderator. Given the pandemic and pestilence of 2020, it's a pleasure to reconnect with you all. Now, this conversation is taking place virtually. We're live streaming on Facebook and YouTube, which we're all familiar with, but I will go through some housekeeping. There will be time to comment and to ask questions. These you can do through Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and I'll work them into the conversation as we go along. To our panelists now, and what you'll notice about our speakers is that in addition to their brilliance, is that they reflect not just the Global South, but the southern axis of the Atlantic Basin. Let me introduce them, starting with Hafsat Abiola. She is the president of the Women in Africa Initiative. Hafsat is also one of the World Future Council's global advisors. She's a recipient of several international awards, including the Vital Voices Award for Public Service, the Goy Peace Foundation Award, and the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leadership Community. Next, we have Daniela Varela. Daniela is the Institutional Secretary of the Latin American Association for Energy Economics, ALEDI. She's also a member of the Argentine Council for International Affairs, CARI. She's an Atlantic Dialogue's emerging leader from the class of 2018. She has a BA in Government and International Relations, as well as a master's degree in energy. I'll now introduce Nkosana Donald Moyo, who is the founder and chairman of the Mandela Institute for Development Studies. He's a former vice president and chief operating officer of the African Development Bank. Dr. Moyo is also a former minister of industry and international trade for Zimbabwe. He's a former co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Africa Regional Agenda, Council on the Future of Africa, and he contested Zimbabwe's presidential elections in 2018. I will thank Dr. Moyo Nkosana for joining us because he's been indisposed, which, as he, speaks later on, you might hear in his voice, but such is his commitment to the Atlantic Dialogues community that he has made time to be with us in this conversation. So thank you, Nkosana. And last but not least, we have Professor Bernardo Sorge. He's the director of the Edelstein Center for Social Research, which is based in Brazil. It's a joint project with the Fernando Henrique Cardoso Foundation. He's a retired professor of sociology at the University of Rio. He's a visiting professor and chair at several European, North American, and Latin American universities. So welcome, everyone. Now, we're seeing an upsurge in discontent around the world, and the COVID-19 pandemic has made those schisms even sharper. So over the course of the next 90 minutes we're going to map out those troubles and figure out what the best response to them might be. But first, I'd like to find out what our listeners think. And there is a link to the question I'm about to ask, which should be going up now on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And the question I have for our listeners is this: if there was a single underlying cause for the discontents in the Global South, what would it be? Would it be 1, shrinking economies and declining standards of living? Would it be 2, political repression and the desire for autonomy? Would it be 3, growing insecurity and inequality? So once again, listeners, if you check on Twitter or Facebook, YouTube, you should see a link to the question I've just asked, which is this: if there was a single underlying cause for the discontents in the Global South, what would it be? Would it be 1, shrinking economies and declining standards of living? Would it be 2, political repression and the desire for autonomy? Would it be 3, growing insecurity and inequality? So we'll leave that question up for a couple of minutes to allow you all to vote. But in the meantime, the panelists and I will get on with answering this question. And so I'll start with you, Bernardo. Given your extensive research on democracy, could you please map out a geography of the disaffection, the discontent across the Atlantic Basin for us? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uduak. I am very happy to be with you all in this new virtual Atlantic dialogue. I would like to focus my introductory remarks by trying to clarify the concept of democracy, which I will have in mind during our conversation. I hope it will help to have a meaningful exchange of ideas. What we are talking about when we speak about democracy. First of all, we are referring to an ideal never attained, but in relation to which we can measure if we are moving forward or backward. In second place, democracy is always a moving reality. What today we take for granted as democratic rights and freedoms can change tomorrow. Things. Of course, it includes political institutions,
Okay, Bernardo, we seem to be losing you every so often. So may I ask
plural,
you
yes,
just to turn off your video for a minute or so to allow your internet connectivity to settle, and then you can come back. But we lost you when you were unpacking the idea of democracy, which I
okay,
suspect is then building up to the disaffection we're seeing. Okay, please carry on. Thank you.
okay. Now I will go back. Uh, as I said, in second place, democracy is a moving reality. What we take for granted today, it wasn't years ago. In the third place, democracy refers to different things when we talk about it. Of course, it includes political institutions that ensure the rule of law, freedom of speech and organization, pluralism, protection of minorities, and free elections. But, and this is also as important, is democracy is also a culture of equality, or rather, it produces a culture of expectations of equality, not only in relation to political rights and the rule of law, but also in relation to material conditions, to access to social good and basic income. Democracy is not viable if it doesn't produce a meaningful life, and in modern societies, it means hope for a better future. Finally, and last but not least, democratic regimes are embedded in capitalist structures. The relation between them is very complex, sometimes complementary, sometimes conflictive. In fact,
Let's give this a minute to see if his.
a key factor for maintaining a functional democracy. Without them, we arrive to
Bernardo,
yes.
there was a bit of a lag with your internet, so we missed the connection that you were painting between democracies in crisis.
Okay, then what I think is important to remember is that democracy also refers to expectations, an expectation related to some level of equality or at least access to social goods. And this refers to the final but basic question. Democratic regimes are embedded in capitalist structures. The relations between them is complex, sometimes complementary, sometimes conflictive. In fact, if we don't produce social pacts that allows economic growth and compensation of social inequality, functional democracies are not viable. This brings us to the subject today, is that we live in a period where democratic expectations or democratic political culture produce resentment and mistrust with democratic political system. Because democracy is now more and more embedded in culture, expectations tend to be frustrated, and it expresses even sometimes with frustration with the political democratic regimes. With those elements in mind, I am sorry for the internet connection, but it's not my fault. I would like to transfer the floor to my colleagues.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Bernardo. So, what you've done is that you've given us this foundation for which much of our societies are built on, or at least aspire to be built on, which is democracy. But the subject that we're dealing with is the discontent with democracy that we're seeing around the world. And so, my next question to you would, could you please situate that discontent for us geographically, whether spatially, whether in terms of ideals, what are we seeing taking place? Why are we having this conversation?
The discontent refers to related but different things. Part of the discontent has to do with, in some cases, with economic stagnation. In other cases, economic growth that is at the same time doesn't solve the problems of inequality. It refers to economic growth that sometimes produce social mobility, but also increase expectations of new, let's call it low middle classes, that wants more. And the states, I am speaking more on the south, but probably in some part of the north south or north is also true, is not at the is not capable of delivering social goods that people would expect from the states. In our country, for instance, you have the fact that taxes increase, but people don't feel return for those taxes. And there is a crisis of hope. There is a crisis of the future. And I think this is global, or at least in many parts of the globe, is that what we feel is that the future that for generation was based on the idea of progress, on the idea that the future will bring better times, is no more the feeling. The feeling is that the new generation is in worse situation than the older generation, that the future of technological progress doesn't bring more employment but unemployment. And let's be honest, what ideologies produced today as an idea of future is basically environmentalist, which are very important, but are telling us that the future is going to be bleak, is going to be difficult, is going to be even catastrophic. Then we have a problem with the future, and when we have problems with the future, political authoritarian demagogues goes back to the past, begin to idealize the past, begin to sell a past that never existed, in fact, as an ideal moment, related also to xenophobic and racist idea. Then I always like to present, if you allow me, Uduak, only to finish, when I teach sociology, is society is an onion. When my student ask me, what is the essence? They say, try to find the essence of an onion, and you begin to take the onion in parts. At the end, you find out that there is no essence other all the different elements that compose the onion.
And there are lots of tears as well.
Yeah, then there is no one only element. We need to accept, and I think this is one of the challenge also related to other elements which I will not come in because it's not our subject today, fake news, disinformation, that tries to simplify and produce one simple opposition that solves all the problems. That is the wrong way to confront really the problems of society.
Good. Thank you very much, Bernardo. So we've got both the foundation and we've got an overarching view of the discontents across the global south. Daniela, I'll stay in Latin America to ask you about the specificities of the discontents where from where you are.
Thank you, Uduak. And shortly, I wanted to mention that I'm very happy to share this panel with all of you as one of the Atlantic Dialogue's emerging leader. Yesterday, the president of Policy Center for the New South have shared the approach of this year to have an intergenerational view on those topics. I'm very happy to be here sharing a little bit about Latin America and my perspective on this. Regarding all what Bernardo was mentioning and expressing on the general situations, I want to add also the situation that between all of that, now we have the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we had already a discontent in Latin America because of all the issues he have expressed, now it is intensively aggravated, I will say. We have even more inequalities to millions of people that do not have access to different opportunities because of this. And of course, if we think of a democracy without the respect of the rule of law or any other of the elements he have expressed, we will see that it's not only inadequate, if not also dangerous. Taking this into consideration, I want to share with you a few data about Latin America that the ECLAC, that is the regional organization on the systems of the United Nations. They have shared some data considering the perspective on this year. And they believe that the GDP of Latin America will contract this year in 9.1%. That in poverty, we will have a 15-year setback, and in extreme poverty, a 30-year setback. And that means that 231 million of people will go back to poverty, and that represents 1/4 of the population in Latin America. Besides, in terms of informality, in Latin America, we see that 53% of the economically active population do not have access to social protection, and that informal workers that are largely women, youth, indigenous people, migrants, cannot generate income, and they lack savings to face the crisis. And then the Inter-American Development Bank have shared their perspective on how will be this economic recovery afterwards. And they suggest in an optimistic way, one that looks like a V, showing a fast recovery, and then of course one more pessimistic that it's like a U. And that means it will take several years for us to recover. And why do I mention poverty and informality? Because as soon as we have a crisis, those are the two indicators that usually fall at first. Poverty and informality. As soon as it starts, we see those indicators falling apart. But as soon that we start the recovery, those are the last ones to recover. So again, we have even more gaps, even more expectations, as Bernardo was expressing, that are not fulfilled in the near future. And then you have this that it doesn't look like it'll be a V and a fast recovery, if not a long one. In that situation, we have to start thinking on the answers of those. And in particular, what I want to mention is that right now we have a lot of exceptional measures because of the situation of the COVID-19. But those are dangerous if they have a permanent situation in Latin America without having the rule of law, all the freedoms that we were expressing before that democracy needs as an ideal. So if we give strong answers that are not only in the short term, but also in the long term. Usually I try to say that the short and the long term start on the same day. So we have to think that those work together and we will think afterwards in a recovery that
Okay.
will take several years, that will be hard, and we need to give answers that are next to each other, thinking on the long term.
Well, hopefully, we'll get into the answers just as after we've heard from everyone. We'll move across the Atlantic to Africa now and go to Nigeria. Hafsat, I'll come to you. And what's interesting, panelists, if you take note of this, if you recall the question I asked our listeners, what's behind the upsurge in discontents across the Atlantic basin? And I gave three options: shrinking economies, political repression, insecurity, and inequality. And the answer from our listeners is insecurity and inequality, followed by shrinking economies, which I've heard reflected from both you, Daniela, and from Bernardo. But Hafsat, this idea of insecurity and inequality as a root of discontent, say in Africa, to what extent would you agree with that? Bearing in mind, which is not to say that you're the Nigerian spokesperson, but we're coming out of, a movement of, expressed discontent around insecurity at the End SARS movement.
Thank you so much, Uduak. And let me just, along with all my colleagues, say what an honor and privilege it is to be part of this dialogue convened by the Policy Center of the New South. This question of insecurity and inequality has been pervasive in Africa, not just even before COVID-19. We've been, one of the pleasures of working at Women in Africa is that we convene this annual summit where we gather like 1,000 people to Morocco from about 80 countries. And a lot of them are coming from outside Africa. We're trying to sell Africa to them, trying to get them to buy in, to want to invest, to want to support women entrepreneurs on the continent. And every year when we convene this event, I would speak about the fact that of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world, maybe half were on the continent of Africa. But the truth of it, and I know that Dr. Moyo knows this better and will probably speak to this when he will speak later, is that Africa's economic growth, as impressive in most of our countries as it has been not inclusive growth. It doesn't generate jobs. It just, it's kind of growth on paper. When I was living in Nigeria, right now I'm in Belgium because my husband works here just down the road in the European Union. But when I was living in Nigeria, and I would read in the papers about our growth and which is among the fastest in on the continent, or even I would read in the paper about how we had now overtaken South Africa to become the #1 largest economy on the continent. And then I would look around. And not just look around, even look at my mobile phone at all the text messages I'm getting day by day from people asking for money because they don't have enough to live. It was just incredible. So even at about February, when we saw that COVID-19 was real, because there was a point in which it looked like it could be contained in China because they're taking such drastic measures. But when I realized that it was going to come to the continent, Uduak, my sister, I sat on my bed and I cried because I just said to myself, how is this thing coming to Africa? What is it going to meet in Africa? I don't know if you saw the video of when the Chinese built a hospital in 10 days with like 1,000 beds. I don't know how many beds we have across the continent. I don't know if we can say we have 10,000 or 20,000 beds in a continent of 1.3 billion people. I just couldn't imagine. And I thought, if this incredible disease is coming to Africa, and we were already so strained, all the communal ties were already so strained, what kind of impact would it have? I felt hopeless. I wept. Then we've just been quite fortunate, that our government's also probably terrified about what was coming. became very aggressive very early, shutting airports, trying to contain the numbers because they knew that we couldn't deal with the numbers in Spain, the kind of numbers they're seeing in Spain, in France, in the United States. We can't deal with those numbers. So, and I think our people on the continent are just tired of waiting for things to get better. And so they're just letting their leadership know that they're tired of waiting for things to get better. And it's one thing for you to be patiently struggling day by day, but then it's another for you to then have the little money you have, the very humble sums that you're earning on that day, be forced from you by police officers that are meant to protect you. When the George Floyd was killed in
In the
the
US.
United States, yes, in the United States, we did a mapping of the police experience, of the African people's experience of their police forces during the COVID-19, in the bid to contain people, to keep people at home. In several African countries, the police just went overboard. There have been killings of people in Kenya, in South Africa, in Nigeria, even before this recent incident that blew up in Nigeria. And with the incident that blew up in Nigeria, there's been solidarity across the continent where people are saying it's good for the Nigerian young people to rise up and challenge the government and say, you've got to do better. So the Nigerian government, I think that this is actually one of the better administrations that we've had in Nigeria since we returned to democratic rule in 1999. This government is not neoliberal. They're not trying to just work for private companies. They're trying to work for the people of Nigeria in a way that is unprecedented and systemic. But we have 200 million people in Nigeria. And even if the government, at the best of times, you could say maybe they're impacting, say, 40 million, you can see that. And if the 40 million is already much better than previous administrations that maybe impacted 5, 10 million, you can still see that there's a huge gap. And then there's the culture, the political culture that the government has. It's too distant for the people. The people want to engage the government. They want to have frequent interaction. So we talk about democracy, and the way that democracy can be practiced in Rwanda is one thing, but the way it has to be practiced in a country like Nigeria, where the people are very, in your face, it has to be different. So I think that the Nigerian government, this has really been a wake-up call for them, and I think in a good way, because if they are sincerely a government that is intent on delivering for the people of Nigeria, well, the people have risen up to say, we want the delivery. So any government that is really sincere should now look to engage them and sit with them, because you see, even within the government, we should understand that the government isn't monolithic. There will be people who are trying to continue the old game of corruption and control of public resources for individual interest and for group interest. So if you are truly sincere and you are for the people of Nigeria, and you see them that they've organized, they're activated, then engage them to protect that agenda of making sure that they get the resources, they get the benefits. Because if you don't, I mean, it doesn't make, it wouldn't, I mean, what could be the reason why you wouldn't?
Okay.
So for now, we've seen that the government is like reeling, but I'm hoping that when they stop reeling, they really begin to look at how they engage young people so that the young people protect and ensure that the dividends of democracy get to them.
Okay, we'll come to those dividends later. But first, we'll stop in Zimbabwe to speak to Dr. Moyo Nkosana, because you, of course, attempted to offer yourself up as a dividend of democracy. And so my question to you would be, given that Zimbabwe and several other African countries are experiencing these expressions of discontent, how do people want their discontent addressed? Please unmute your mic. Unmute your mic. You're muted. Still muted. Still muted.
Uduak, can you unmute him?
No, I don't have the controls. I'll ask the team at AD, Yasir and Mohammed, whether you could unmute.
Moyo, on the upper
Okay,
corner
I think
of
so.
Oh,
I
there
think
we
it's
go.
okay
We found
now,
it. We
Okay.
got it.
Yeah. So thank you very much. And yeah, you asked, I mean, I listened carefully to my colleagues and all their observations are correct. And I think you're trying to limit me too much to a Zimbabwean situation. I think we've got a continental problem. My first observation is that a lot of our institutions or attempts at institutional behavior are caricatures of things we don't actually understand. Starting with the country, the nation state itself. A lot of African countries are countries in name only, not in reality. We have not, since the Berlin Conference, we've not really grappled with the concept of what it is. What is a society beyond the tribe and the nuclear family? We have not engaged with how to build a society where you can then begin to talk about social compact or contracts, as Edward was mentioning. Because that whole concept of inclusivity, we use these words, but what do they mean? Why do you want them? For me, a country is a bit like a club, and I know I'm simplifying it a lot. If I'm a member of a club, I expect the rules of the club firstly to come from me as a member of the club. We then appoint an administration body who administer the club on behalf of the members. And there is incredible clarity about who is the owner and who is just an administrator. And when you look at what we call advanced countries, I think there is generally an understanding of where the power lies with the people. But as Eduardo mentioned earlier on, democracy is an evolution. It's a dynamic process. It's evolving all the time. The democracy we are trying to implement is copying something that is matured a long way before we even started. But we haven't sunk the roots of democracy in our own societies for the people to take ownership of the concept of democracy. So let me just kind of segue away from my own experiences. This issue of ownership is a fascinating one. The concept, I think, of the citizens in the South of what ownership means is very distorted. They actually don't believe they own power. They continue to worship the rulers as the owners of power. They don't live the reality that they give them the power. So as a result, they hold them on a pedestal and they worship them. They encourage the bad behavior and they don't take responsibility for insisting on accountability from these people. In fact, they look for patronage from these people. And it's a fascinating one when you participate in an election because our people turn the election process into a transaction. They think that when they elect you, they are doing you a favor, and as a result, you owe them a favor in return. As an individual, not as a society. And it's a favor, not an obligation. So the accountability is, if I elect you, what are you going to do for me and my family? Not for us as a society. So we, the people, not just our rulers, we, the people, are the confused lot. Because we've not really understood that we are the owners of this thing called democracy and the institutions that result from it. As a result, a lot of what we see is a reenactment of George Orwell's Animal Farm. Our struggles, the fights that you're referring to, the society fighting, they are not fighting to change the system. They are fighting to join and participate in the bad behavior because of the patronage nexus, yeah? It's not like, and that's why you see a continuous repeat. There is no instance you can point out to me where the so-called opposition of yesterday comes into power and behaves genuinely differently from the previous, because all they want to do is to do what the previous ones were doing, as opposed to transforming the society. Let me take a step back and be a bit more generous in my interpretation. And I observed this in Zimbabwe very firsthand. In the first generation, immediately post-independence, when you looked at Black senior executives, whether it was in the public sector or in the private sector, they were abusive of the natives or the locals as the whites had been before them. Because what they internalized is a position behavior relative to the population. And they thought, if I'm the CEO, all I know is how I saw the CEO yesterday behaving. And that means today it's my right to do the same thing. Our politicians did the same, and we are still doing the same. So we are replaying a bad architecture and not attempting to change it, fundamentally because we have not reconstructed our societies or understood what a society is. And so inclusivity does not even begin to arise. Because was colonialism inclusive? The answer is no. And that's what we internalize and socialize. So why are we using this vocabulary? There is not a single example you can point to. Maybe Kagame, maybe. A little bit.
In Rwanda.
I can see Uduak sort of. But you know, I know that Kagame is being condemned in terms of his human rights approach. Kagame, however, is modeling himself after Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. At least from a societal point of view, he's trying to do the right thing for the whole society. But this thing of hierarchy and the ruling class versus all ordinary people and the human rights and so on, absolutely, it's a journey and he is not there yet. And I can go across his border to Ethiopia, at least under Meles. Again, I would say under Meles was an attempt to deliver value to the society in as inclusive a way as you could get at this point in time in their evolution. So our problem is that when I approach the so-called ordinary person, and if you were to engage them on their understanding of the role of government to start with, what is the role of government? When as a candidate, they ask you to start financing projects before you are in government, they want you to put resources into financing projects in their community so that they can vote for you. They want you to buy their vote. They are not listening and looking at your track record in terms of what potential public servant could you become. They say you have to do things for me now as a favor for me to vote for you. So the kind of people who come through and get voted for are now people who have invested literally, again, going back to Eduardo, capitalism. They have put out real capital to buy votes. And this capital is going to get a return on the other side. And so they steal, and we are surprised about the corruption, but we as the voters create that circumstances by what we ask for. And we don't seem to understand the contradictions that, in fact, even the issue of corruption, when you're saying to me, give me money, buy me this and the other so that I can vote for you, if these are not seeds for corruption, tell me what is. So we, the citizens, are confused and we do not know what we want. That would be my opinion. That would be my observation. And so I welcome the people who are out there listening to use their own examples to disabuse me if I misunderstand or misinterpret what I'm observing on the ground. That we, the people, are confused and we are not taking responsibility. We demand rights, but we don't accept responsibility. We don't understand that rights actually stem from execution of responsibility. A nation cannot ask for shelter, demand that shelter is a right, food is a right. All these things are rights when you don't, on the other side, run a functioning economy that creates the wealth with which to do all these things. Who is going to finance the rights?
So, Nkosana, my takeaway from what you're saying basically is that people, voters, citizens, are the architects of their own discontent.
Yes.
Okay.
But they don't understand the disconnect in their behavior and the correlation between their own behavior and the outcomes of that behavior.
So if we then start talking about how we shift this behavior, because across the Atlantic basin, even as we're having a South-South conversation, we're seeing similar manifestations of discontent, whether it's protest movements, whether it's people falling back into poverty, extreme poverty, as we've been hearing, whether it's the fact that people have no means of livelihood, whether it's the fact that people think that their future prospects are bleak. So if we turn our attention now to what some of you have put on the table, the social pact, the social contract, and how we modify it to suit our circumstances to ensure that wherever we are actually content. What would that look like? How does that shift take place?
So Uduak, let's try to be very systematic. The ordinary person reacts to symptoms of a situation. The ordinary person often does not ask why these symptoms have come to be and what were the causes of why we are where we are. They will react very emotionally and very strongly to their lived reality that they are experiencing without looking at the force field driving circumstances to bring this about, okay? So in other words, the reactions are not surprising, and I'm not even saying they are wrong. The diagnostic, however, of why are these things happening is where we then fall short in terms of understanding what we need to change. We need to understand the causes of what these outcomes. If you go and vote, so you know what, and I don't want to personalize this, you can take away, but it's an interesting exercise. Go to look at the candidates, presidential candidates of Zimbabwe for 2018. Just go and do your own homework. Look at these people and they put on typically the frame I would use is the private sector frame, which says I'm the owner of a company, and as a citizen, I'm the owner of a company called Zimbabwe Inc. I'm looking for a CEO to get me out of a particular situation, i.e., my economy is not behaving. And therefore, I draw up a job description of what are the attributes of the individual I'm looking for in order for this person to come and manage my company out of this circumstance. And then use a filter to look at all of those candidates who run and tell me in your own time privately, inbox me, how many would have made the shortlist if you really were using causality in that form. I.e., I know what I want and why I want it, and I'm going to use that to draw up a job description and then use it to screen the candidates who apply, which is the process we should use, but we never do. And then when that doesn't work, we blame somebody else. But yet we are the people who are holding the processes to produce this CEO that we've appointed, but we don't take responsibility.
Okay, thank you. Bernardo, I'll come to you because even as we have this conversation, we're waiting for the final result of the American election. And it's interesting and relevant to our conversation just because we know that there's been a lot of discontent in the US. Some with the incumbent administration, some with the opposing party. And yet, I think everyone on this call, most of our listeners would be stunned to see that the results are so close. Okay? But for the pandemic, there's quite a bit of analysis that suggests that the Democratic Party would not have had a chance. So in terms of crafting and designing this social contract or an order that speaks to discontent or eliminates it, how do you explain what we're seeing in the US, which is replicated elsewhere across the world?
Sorry, you asked Eduardo.
I'm asking Bernardo.
Yeah, Bernardo. Can I just make an observation because it's fascinating? Look at the turnout of these elections in the US. I would say this is an indication of the population taking responsibility. Our populations will complain and protest and what have you, and when it comes to elections, what levels of turnout do you get? People protest, but don't take responsibility for acting on producing the result they want. At least in the US on this occasion, people have understood that their own actions will directly result in a president either who they want or who will produce the wrong things for them. They've taken ownership.
Right. I think the experience across Africa, Nkosana, in Kenya, Nigeria, people might queue for hours under the sun. And, the US has experienced this, the little gremlins that interfere with the counting and with the results as expressed by the voters. But Bernardo, help us explain what we're seeing.
Thank you, Uduak. If I may take this opportunity again to go to my professorial tendency, let me say the following. Very abstract, but I think it's very important also to what Nkosana was saying, and everybody was mentioned here, is a society is democracy, capitalism is never ever only about one only value. It includes individualism, it includes solidarity, it includes freedom of expression, but also includes civility and respect. It includes fraternity, but includes also my family. Then society is about putting together different values that only in a religious mind they go completely together. They never go together. There are conflicts, contradictions, and let's say the creativity of society, of each society and political leaders, is to make the best synthesis. You never maximize only one value. If you maximize individualism, you create a neoliberal hell. If you maximize collectivism, you create a Stalinist hell. Then the challenge is always putting things together. Being said that, that means that we should be honest. COVID created major dramas for any government in the world. It wasn't, even for the best, most brilliant government, an easy game. You had public health, but also other factors. You can say what was the best policy, but you also know that there were a lot of unknowns, and therefore there were mistakes was impossible not to be made, more or less. Then we should recognize that it wasn't easy to be government for anybody under COVID conditions. There were too many unknowns. This is the first point. The second point is quite interesting. What happened in the States and also in Brazil, for instance, is that many people, that especially the poorest sector, that wanted to work, they say, okay, I may have COVID, but for me it's secondary to the fact that I need to work. And they supported politicians with an irresponsible discourse about what is COVID Trump case. Then Trump, but also happened in Brazil, lost support in sectors of the middle classes that wanted a more protective, public health oriented policy. And on the other hand, he got votes from Latino and blacks, for instance, that for them sectors, I'm not saying, of course, we are not generalizing, we are talking always about sectors, that for them the priority was what Nkosana was talking about, individual priorities about surviving. In this case, very understandable. Then this is the first point I wanted to make. There is no ever a clear response. In the case of Trump, clearly it has to do more with personal characteristics of social irresponsibility, lack of empathy, solidarity, and so on. But it must be said, it wasn't and is not yet still a clear path how is the best way to confront COVID in different social conditions. In the case of Brazil, For instance, I would say overall what was good in the sense of consequences, that people understood the importance of having a public health system with all the problems it has. It's good that exists. And of course, it's clear in the case of the states, the drama of not having a public health system. And I hope it will have positive consequences. Only to make a last point, I think one of the things that is part of the unknown, we don't know exactly how the COVID will have consequences in the future, other what Daniela mentioned on the economic, that are quite dramatic, different in different countries, that those are clear. Because one of the issues that we are confronting today and is that some phenomena that has to do with frustration, social inequality, doesn't produce positive electoral reactions of people trying to find a more uh, collective social project. On the contrary, eh, people, in the case of Brazil, for instance, but in some extent also in the states, or clearly in Africa, the issue of insecurity produce a reaction, very individualized, me first, eh, we should use more violence against criminal gangs and so on. Then the problem with social reactions to social problems, there is no, it's not a mathematical. eh. Social problems can produce a lot of negative, authoritarian, almost semi-fascist reactions we should always be aware of. Then, and this is the final point I wanted to mention because the issue is so complex, is we should always take care with a culture that in some cases, I don't want to generalize, it went too deep in civil society of denouncing without proposing solutions, creating high level of expectations on every aspect of social life that are completely unrealistic. We should be more related to the real issues, to also do advocacy, and more, if I may say, using words of my past, a more reformist and less revolutionary uh, narrative. If we put our stakes too high, we increase the level of frustration and open the door to authoritarian demagogues.
Okay. Hafsat, I'll come to you. And Bernardo, thank you for introducing civil society, because Hafsat, to some extent, your background is grounded in civil society. And there's a question from one of our listeners who asks, who's to blame? Public decision makers who are not implementing effective development policies, or civil society that is not strong enough to make its voice heard and its interests defended? And of course, the point Bernardo has been making is that, sometimes civil society doesn't necessarily use deploy the best strategies to deliver. So how would you respond to that question? I think ignore the blaming, because we've moved away from that. What we're trying to do is craft solutions. Hafsat, thank you.
I think that if we take as a point of departure all that Dr. Moyo already said, which is that we're in a continent where the institutions by which we're trying to govern ourselves are not ours. They were imposed. And we're not, I think, in a country like Zimbabwe, you have quite high literacy, but in some parts of the continent, literacy, by which I mean learning of the Western educational system, is not even 70%. So we have a large swathe of the population that don't haven't gotten the means to really grapple with this foreign system that is in the country. Now, I find it very fascinating when we use the word democracy, because when we say democracy, we expect that the people understand the system. That's, I mean, it's power to the people. So the system by which we're governing them should be theirs, or at least they should own it. But we have to accept that we don't quite have that. So what we have is a kind of caricature. And when you have that, it's very difficult for the people governing and for the people being governed, because there's all kinds of room for miscommunication, for misunderstanding. And then if you then come to what Professor Bernardo was saying about the civil society and the weakness in the systems of these countries, then what you have, and I think, you know, because I used to work, I founded an organization in Nigeria like over 20 years ago, and I've worked very closely with many civil society organizations.
And the
Then,
organization you founded had to do with your own family's struggle, your family's experience in agitating for democracy.
yes, you know, because my mom was gunned down by the soldiers in Nigeria. My father died in prison because he had done what Dr. Moyo tried to do. You know, he had been such a successful businessman and, you know, this huge person and huge mind, a chartered accountant, in a continent where multinationals are stealing so much of our wealth. So, I mean, if you were to take a CV, do the same exercise that Dr. Moyo asked be done for Zimbabwe, and you do it for Nigeria, my father, MKO, landslide anytime. And the Nigerian people actually gave him the
He did
landslide.
give the land. He did get the
He won
landslide.
like
Yeah.
50% of the vote, but the military thought otherwise. And so that's a long, tragic story. But what I want to come to is my experience of civil society. So you're there doing really important work. And then you then have to then write a report and say to somebody, I'm doing really important work. Can you please give me some money to do more? And then they tell you, oh, oops, sorry, we've changed our priorities now and we've moved on to, so you're doing maybe training of women and formation of women so that they can play a part in governance. Then they'll tell you, now we are into water. Now, some civil society organizations start trying to recraft, change their whole mandate so that they too can be into water. Or, you know, or they say, okay, we'll look for other people, other organizations, foundations that will give support. It's not a credible model for building and for creating the kind of movement and the awareness that the continent needs. I saw something, and it's not just the continent. I was one time hanging out with the people at the Carter Center in the US, former President Jimmy Carter's center in Atlanta. And there was a comment that somebody made that if Martin Luther King had been from a civil society organization, he wouldn't have achieved 1% of what he achieved, because you know, imagine he came out of the Birmingham jail and he wants to organize a march and he starts writing a proposal, you know, I mean, where would we start? So it's just really, I think what we need on the continent, if we want to be sincere, we need our own model. We need to, and I think that Rwanda is already working a lot in this direction, because you see, what we're trying to do now, we look to others and we say, it's what they did isn't working here, it's our problem. No, it's not our problem. The problem is that, why are we using what they did? First, we don't have their history. Second, we don't have their same asset base. I mean, if we're trying to use the model used in England, have we gone to take over all of India and take their wealth, and take over all of Africa, take their wealth, and to finance what we're doing in England? Have we moved all our discontent to America, to New Zealand, to Australia? We don't have their structure, so why are we trying to copy their model? We should come with our own understanding, look at our own situation, our people as they are. Our people are not a problem to be solved. They're just what they are. They are people. They have certain assets and certain weaknesses, and we should craft for ourselves what makes sense, how we should then, because what we have to do is we have to solve a problem. And the nature of the problem is we have 1.3 billion people spread around 54 countries. And we need to be able to give them decent jobs. We need to be able to increase their skills so that they have options. And we need to be able to engage with our global partners in such a way that they leave enough resources on the continent for us to finance that. So there are very clear needs that we need to put in place that requires us to not try to copy our friends, but actually, instead of having civil society be a watchdog, civil society should be a partner with government and private sector. And by private sector, I mean indigenous private sector in Africa, Africa's own entrepreneurs. We should all sit together like a tripod table and see how we then move the continent forward. We move the countries of the continent forward. I think that's the first basis, is that it's been 60, Nigeria marked 60 years after colonization, since independence last month. It's been 60 years. We're adults now. We can now take responsibility for our own situation and create what works for us.
Okay, great. Daniela, I want to come to you, but before I do that, I would like to ask our audience something. If we agree, and Bernardo can correct me on this, that civil war is a very extreme manifestation of discontent. And the question, which you can find on Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook, is that since 1945, when when we started living in this current economic order, how many civil wars have been fought in the Atlantic basin? How many civil wars have the countries, surrounding the Atlantic fought? And the options are 0 to 10 civil wars, to 10 to 20 civil wars, or 20 to 30 civil wars. Since 1945, how many civil wars have been fought? And that's a question for our listeners. And that question is posted on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. And it will be interesting to see what we think. And so, Daniela, I'll come to you because there's a specific question. Like Hafsat, you started talking about, the solutions, what we need to do going forward. But given the dire predictions that we're seeing, not just in Latin America, but around the world as a result of the impact of COVID, the question to you is this. To what extent is it possible for policies and systems, and a listener asked this questions, to introduce economic growth plans with justice or environmental protection all together as an answer to these social claims and uprisings?
Thank you for that question, Uduak. And I was thinking a lot while the other panelists were answering, because they had the civil society perspective, the sociology perspective, and I wanted to add also from the political analyst perspective, the idea of how important it is to have a social accountability. Guillermo O'Donnell, who is an Argentine author, used to talk about the accountability on a horizontal way, which means between agencies in the government, and in a vertical way, that means in elections. When we go to elections and we actually say over the air that we agree or disagree with one person. But then other authors added the idea of social accountability. And the Latino Barometer, for example, which it brings us some statistics on the situation in Latin America, shows us that on these 30 years of democracy in the region, until 2009, I think it was 2009, the percent of people believing on institutions, and in particular on the presidents, was around 60%, which means that actually people were thinking that the democracy and their institutions were going to give the answers we needed to have a sustainable future and to see all the things that we need to have an answer from the government. Since then until now, it dropped until 20 or 30% on the belief of the people. So it's 30% less than before, and it's very little, which means that we need to have a stronger democracy, we need to have stronger institutions. And for that reason, I want to point out the idea of one of the authors talking about the social accountability. And it reflects that there are new actors in the political arena. And we have to take into considerations those actors to have the new social compact or contract, as everyone was telling, because there are a lot of feelings that are not individual feelings. The discontent is not something individual, it's social. And we need to have those answers in this way. And the three strategies that the name is Perusotti and Smulovitz share is that when the social accountability could activate the horizontal and vertical accountability mechanisms, can reinforce and sometimes are even stronger than that. And that means when you were talking about civil wars, it could be even go to the extreme positions. And those strategies are legal ones, to exposing and reporting presumed illegal acts, mobilization strategies. And on mobilization, we can have protests, we can have NGO activisms, and nowadays I think the stronger voices and that we see and that are more cohesive inside are feminisms and um, environmental protection. Those are actually, I think, the two stronger ones that we can see as one of the important voices to hear. And of course, I want to add also here in mobilization strategy, the idea of having the think tanks, sitting persons to speak and realize the situation from different perspectives, as this Atlantic Dialogues Conference is. And the last one, as we have Uduak here, is the media strategy and how we have investigative journalism. But nowadays we have to think also on social media and the direct connection on that. In particular, I wanna go to your point on if we will be able to realize the 17 objectives of the 2030 agenda. Because when we talk about economic growth, when we think about the environment, when we think on the social perspective, we are talking if we will realize those objectives, that are all the ones that, for example, Hafsat was mentioning. If we will have a quality education, if we will have decent work, if we will have gender equality, if we will have stronger institutions, stronger coalitions, and no hunger. I think it is hambre zero. So it's like with people without having the food and all other situations. If we are thinking on that, we even need a stronger way to find a social activism. In particular, I want to mention that nowadays, because of the COVID-19, one strong point is that we are having stronger governments, or I will say stronger activities from the governments, but also what our society needs to take into account and take actions on it, that whenever we have more fundings, more subsidies, more stimulus in the economy that are needed, also we have greater opportunities for corruption. So then we need a stronger society to take into consideration that, and to ask for transparency, and to ask for to have the right fundings in the right way being used for a better future.
So Daniela, you and Hafsat, have been talking, if we're to sum it up, about building back better. But to what extent, when we have these sorts of conversations about discontent, is the framing, because it sounds like discontent is something negative. To what extent is it a positive thing that alerts people to the fact that something terrible has gone badly wrong? And so therefore, to the point that Nkosana was making, people wake up to their own individual and collective responsibility and act.
Yes, as I was saying about the idea of activating the mechanisms that should work always, that's a positive impact and should be a permanent one. And because they can reinforce the institutions. And in particular, nowadays, in this crisis, what we've seen as Hafsat is working in the civil society perspective is that a lot of the mechanisms and answers during this pandemic didn't come from the government or only from the private sector, if not from the society. So then they have to work together, because governments cannot give all the answers. They need to give sometimes the best structure they can, but they need to work on a more multi-stakeholder approach with other perspectives. And we have to add people on the table. And it's always hard to think in a huge table where we need a huge consensus among everyone, but we do need minimum consensus on the approach. And then we can think on the long term and not only in the short one. So I actually believe it's important, and it should keep being the social accountability, one of the stronger mechanisms inside the democracy to have a more coherent future and coordinated one.
Thank you. And so, Nkosana, I'll come to you to ask you the same question around your observation about people waking up to their responsibility. Do you see these discontents that we're discussing as a bad thing, as a positive thing, or just as a necessary tool for democratic evolution?
It is not a bad thing at all, but the energy that is contained in this discontent is unlikely to be properly channeled if there is no proper understanding of the agency that society has. We're going to run around and expend all this energy with no results whatsoever. But once we understand the agency element, we can use this to energize us, but also take ownership of the course of action and understand. For instance, let me look at the issue of civic society. My view would be that civic society's primary target or focus in our spaces should be civic education. But civic society tends to mimic our governments, our rulers. They want to do things for people. Rather than teaching them to fish, they give them fish. It's wrong. So they need to help people really take ownership again and understand what they can achieve and what their objectives should be, and their role in implementing or acting in order to bring the results about. Yeah. So it's not a bad thing at all, but I think the way we use it needs some panel beating.
Okay, great, thank you. So we'll start wrapping up our conversation. We had just about 90 minutes for this. And so I have a question, for all of you, as we wait for our listeners to send in their response to the question about civil war. And my closing question to you, as you give us your final thoughts, if you were president of the Atlantic Basin, given the discontents that we are seeing, and you will recall that our listeners thought that the greatest source of discontent in the Atlantic Basin was insecurity, what three things would you do to respond to the discontent on your hands? And perhaps I will, since you've got the mic, Nkosana, I'll start with you. What three things would you do if you're president of the Atlantic Basin to respond to the discontent on your hands? And our listeners are telling us that the greatest source of discontent is insecurity and inequality.
So the way you, excuse me, sort of kind of pushing back at the way you framed the question in the first place, you seemed to imply that the issues of shrinking economies and the issues of insecurity and inequality are not linked.
I do believe they're linked.
It's a direct product of the other. Therefore, it's not a question of either or.
Of course not. They are linked.
One results from the other.
But this is what I wanted to get from our listeners. Of course, we all know on this panel that they're linked.
So therefore, for me, everything has to start with managing an economy that's going to create the space to address these issues. But the other thing that I would try to make my community, my society, my countrymen understand is that we are our own liberators in that sense, use the cliche if you like. At the moment, our rulers are serving as a very bad example because they are teaching our children to be beggars. They are running around the world asking for favors, asking for things, as opposed to looking at the resources that we are sitting on and translating those into the resources we need to grow our economies and put us in a much better negotiating position, because global relationships at the end of the day require leverage in order for you to strike the deals that you need at an equitable place, win-win. If you're going there as a beggar, you will never get an appropriate transaction done. So we need to strengthen ourselves. We need to understand who we are and what we have and make it count in our external relationships. So, and the other thing, incidentally, and I keep telling people that we, my generation, me included, we have become agents of colonization in a manner that is much worse than any white man ever did. Excuse me, by the way, I kept calling you Eduardo Bernardo, my apologies, okay? The reason why we've become the worst agents of colonization is because the way we run our countries, the way we run our institutions, our children's lived reality is to associate with things that are foreign and not things that are domestic. Whether it's hospitals, whether it's schools, those who've got money take their children out of that system, including the politicians themselves. But the socialization that is taking place through that process is an association. What is good is foreign, and what is local is never experienced as good.
So, Nkosana, we have 10 minutes. Yeah, so we have 10 minutes. What I've heard from you is that your silver bullet, to some extent, if I were to simplify it in that way, would be proper economic stewardship, but also taking into account what we own and fostering a sense of ownership. Great. Hafsat, I'll come to you. What would you do to address the discontent on your hands if you were president of the Atlantic Basin? What three things would be your priority?
I would strengthen, so the Atlantic Basin, by which you're referring to the African continent and Latin America?
And the global north as well, but this conversation reflects the south, the southern axis of the Atlantic Basin.
Okay, so I think that if I were president of the entire triangular nexus, I would look to put forward a win-win-win global economic pact. You know, I would look to completely redesign the global economic system so that we're not writing off the continent of Africa and of Latin America, and concentrating wealth in the global north.
Thank you.
That injustice of 400 years, it's more than enough time to address it. And I need to say one more thing. The second thing I would do would be to address gender inequality, because if I did that, I would stabilize all economies all over the world, because women invest more in their families, they strengthen communities. With women with income, they put 85% of the income in their families. For men, it's 30%. So if I were to build women's power and build women's economic power, make sure that they have the support, because in many African economies, and I suspect also in Latin America, they're in the informal sector. Well, in the informal sector, there are too many risks and they don't have the capacity to really grow their business. They're not going to become Amazon from the informal sector. So I would look to build a pathway to formality, giving them technical support, making sure that they have access to finance, not just at micro level, but at mesofinance level. Because I know that if I give women power, then that power stays in the communities and will transform their communities and stabilize their communities.
Thank you very much. I wonder, Bernardo, if you can be quick with this. What would you do if you were president of the Atlantic Basin to address the discontents on your hands?
Okay, I will begin rapidly saying very short, clear. If I would be president, my first act would be to renounce. I'm not ready to take the job. Being said that, I would like to only to point out a very important issue. It was mentioned economic inequality and insecurity. And you mentioned, Uduak, that they are related. They are. But I think one of the major mistakes of many politicians with a lot of goodwill that emphasize inequality is to think that they are exactly the same, because they are not, especially from the point of view of expectation of the citizens. Because if you expect to solve the problem of insecurity at the same pace that you are going to solve the problem of inequality, that means 30, 40, 50, 60 years, and the population wants solutions now. Then the first point is to say they are related, they are not the same. One of the great mistakes of many politicians with a lot of goodwill, including in Brazil, but also in general in Latin America, is being politically correct, is to speak only about the social dimensions of insecurity. They exist. But you can't say that they are the same, and it's not what people expect. And I can understand people that go into the street this night and not in 10 years when people will have education, etc., etc. Then is to say they are related but are different issues, and they demand different policies that will be in some degree related, but they are not the same.
Thank you very much. We hear you. You don't want to be president of the Atlantic Basin. But let's see if the newer generation, Daniela, if we gave you the opportunity to be president of the Atlantic Basin, what three things would you do to respond to the discontents on your hands?
Thank you, Uduak. And I wanted to express here an idea from two Argentine authors, Actis and Malek Alza, where they talk about the 3M democracy, that we should have a multidimensional, multi-stakeholder, and multi-level diplomacy. And on international affairs, we need that, particularly us in the global south. In this moment that we have an entropic world, if we have no rules, we will mostly lose because the rules will be imposed by the powerful ones. So multilateralism for us, it's not an ideological approach, if not a pragmatic one. We need more anticipation, flexibility, adaptation, rather than rigid organizations to reach those consensus and public goods as those strategies we are having for the vaccine with several countries. Okay. And to having the opportunity to have Nkosana Moyo here, and because I work a lot at the educational sector, I want to quote Mandela. And Mandela said that education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And taking into consideration this idea and the SDG 4 of the 2030 agenda, which is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all, I want to point out that I think it's one of the main strategies we need to follow because access to education, it's not a privilege, it's a human right. It's a fundamental right that we need in our societies. Okay. And to finalize two of the ideas that we have expressed here, but I want to go back, it's that we were talking about building back better. And I will also try to think and to picture the idea of building forward, building future better. Because we know that some of the inequalities and discontents we were talking pre-existed before the COVID. So we don't need to actually build the same rules. We need to change some of them. And those preconditions, of course, were taking us to sometimes the wrong ways.
And all right, no, Daniela, we're out of time. Thank you, sir. I needed you to be quick with that, and I think we have just about 2 or 3 minutes left. But your points are taking build back better, but not just back better, but building forward. So thank you very much for that. I asked our listeners a question which had to do with civil war, just as a very extreme form of discontent. And the question was, since 1945 and this current economic order that we find ourselves, how many civil wars have been fought in the Atlantic Basin? And as we go away, this might be food for thought for us, because the options were 0 to 10, 10 to 20, and 20 to 30. And most people who are listening to this conversation thought that the answer was 20 to 30. And so that is the image that the Atlantic Basin has, whereas the correct answer is actually 10 to 20. 10 to 20, just under 20 civil wars have been fought on both sides of the Atlantic. And so as we wind up, that's food for thought. It does seem that we, have an image as a volatile, geographical region. But it's been an interesting conversation. And as you can see from some of the questions that have been coming in, it's been very, very rich and enriching. And so I'd like to thank our speakers, Nkosana Moyo, Daniela Varela, Hafsat Abiola Costello, and Professor Bernardo Sorge. I'd like to thank you all for making time for this conversation and for the Atlantic Dialogues community. I'd also like to thank the Atlantic Dialogues community, our friends there, for bringing us back together in spite of the vagaries of the pandemic. Many thanks to all of you, and good luck, stay safe, be well. We'll see you hopefully next year. Bye.
Thank you very much, Uduak.
Bye.
All the best for all of you.
Yes.
Take care.
Thank you.